They poured a foundation across my only driveway while I was gone for 3 days, and by the time I came back, I couldn't even reach my own cabin. I stood there staring at it in disbelief, wondering how something so obviously wrong could already be halfway built. And what made it worse, they looked completely convinced they were right. I still remember that morning like it was yesterday. The air was cold, the trees were still dripping from an early storm, and my life on 8 acres in Cedar Hollow County had always been the kind of quiet you almost take for granted. No drama, no disputes, just me, my cabin, and a long gravel driveway that winds through the pines like it belongs in another decade. I'm Caleb Mercer, and I've lived on that land since 2009, maintaining every inch of that driveway myself, clearing fallen branches, fixing washouts after heavy rain, keeping it passable through every season because it's not just a path. It's the only way in and out of my world, 300 feet from the county road, fully inside my surveyed boundary, marked, recorded, and never once questioned, until the Halloway couple moved in next door. Evan and Lila Halloway were from Boston. At least that's what they told everyone. Though Evan liked to say New York when he wanted to sound more important, they bought the adjacent lot through a fast cash deal, called it their escape from city chaos, and showed up with architects, drones, and one of those energy that makes you feel like your quiet life is about to get rearranged whether you agree or not. The first time I met Evan, I was cutting up a fallen oak that had dropped across the lower part of my drive after a storm, sweat on my shirt, chainsaw still humming down, and he just pulled up in a black SUV like he was scouting a movie location. He rolled down his window, smiled a little too confidently, and asked what kind of area this was like I was the tour guide for my own home. I told him it was quiet, mostly self-maintained land, no HOA nonsense, just people respecting boundaries, and he nodded like he understood, but the kind of nod you later realize means absolutely nothing. Lila was quieter, more observant, always looking past people instead of at them, like she was already designing something over whatever existed. For a while, things stayed normal. They started clearing their lot, surveying, bringing in contractors. I went back to my routine, thinking at worst I'd get some noise during construction and maybe a few misplaced property flags. I even helped once when their delivery truck got stuck near the shared access road. No bad feelings, just rural courtesy. But something shifted when I left for a short fishing trip up north, just 3 days, nothing unusual. When I came back late afternoon, I noticed the trees at the end of my driveway looked different, too clean, too open, like something had been carved out. I drove closer, dust kicking up under my tires, and then I saw it. A concrete foundation sitting directly across my driveway entrance, steel rebar sticking up like ribs, wooden form still in place. And no mistake about it, this wasn't near my land, it was on it. I parked my truck halfway down the drive, got out slowly, and just stood there for a moment trying to make it make sense. My cabin was behind that structure. My only access route was blocked by a half-built 2-car garage. I called Evan immediately, trying to stay calm, and he answered like I was calling about the weather. I told him very clearly that he had built a structure across my driveway, and I couldn't get through. There was a pause, then he said something I will never forget because of how casually wrong it was. He said they assumed that strip of land belonged to them, and then he actually suggested I just drive around through the wooded edge like it was nothing, like my driveway was an optional suggestion instead of legal access. I told him no, that the survey was clear, that the driveway had been established for decades and fully recorded within my property lines, and his tone shifted immediately, not apologetic, not confused, but defensive in a way that told me this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. He said their builder had measured from the road, that mistakes happen, and then he added, almost casually, that the structure was already underway and stopping now would be expensive, so I should probably figure something out or take it to court. That night, I didn't sleep much. I walked the edge of my property with a flashlight, tracing old survey markers, trying to understand how someone could just build across a living access route and act like it was negotiable. By morning, I called my attorney, a man named Douglas Reeve, who had handled rural land disputes for most of his career, and when I explained it to him, he didn't even hesitate. He just asked for the survey and said, if what you're telling me is accurate, they've built an illegal obstruction on your land. And they're not just wrong, they're exposed. Within a day, he sent a formal notice demanding immediate removal of the structure within 10 days. No negotiation, no easement discussion, just compliance. Evan's response came from a law office in Manhattan. Polished language, corporate tone, claiming reliance on builder measurements, and suggesting that since construction had already begun, we should consider granting an easement in exchange for compensation, essentially asking me to sell access to my own driveway. Douglas laughed when he read it, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, and he told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said this was going to turn into a test of whether they believed property law was optional. Meanwhile, construction didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. I watched from my porch as walls started going up on what was still legally my driveway entrance. Workers framing what would eventually become a garage roof, trucks coming and going like nothing was wrong. And every time I called Evan, he repeated the same line. Their lawyer said continue until a judge says otherwise. That sentence stuck with me more than anything because it revealed the mindset clearly, not confusion anymore, but defiance wrapped in legal delay. So Douglas filed for an emergency injunction, and for a few weeks, everything moved through court filings, affidavits, surveys, satellite imagery, and testimony from the original land records office. And I'll admit, during that time, I kept going out there just to look at it. This half-built structure sitting where my life was supposed to flow freely, like a physical argument I couldn't ignore. Evan and I stopped pretending to be polite. One evening, I walked down there while a crew was working and told him directly to stop construction on my property, and he barely looked at me when he said, "Then let the judge tell us to stop." There was something unsettling about how calm he was, like the certainty of being from a world where consequences always arrive late. 6 weeks later, we were in front of Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense rural property judge who had seen every variation of land disputes you could imagine, and he spent maybe 20 minutes reviewing everything before leaning back and saying what I already knew had been coming. The survey was definitive. The structure was on my property. It blocked legal access, and it must be removed within 14 days, or I would be authorized to proceed with removal and recover costs. No debate, no ambiguity, just law applied cleanly. I remember walking out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't felt since this started, not anger, but certainty, because for the first time the situation had a timeline, and consequences had become official. But what happened next would push everything into a final confrontation none of us could ignore, because even after the ruling, Evan kept building. And that's where everything crossed from legal dispute into something irreversible. And I'm going to tell you exactly what I did when those 14 days ran out. But first, you need to understand what it felt like watching someone ignore a judge while standing on your own land. Part 2, the 14 days didn't feel like a countdown at first, more like a test of patience I didn't ask to take. And every morning I'd wake up expecting to see some change. Maybe workers packing up, maybe a pause, maybe even the smallest sign of respect for what a court had already made clear. But instead the site kept moving forward like the ruling was just background noise. By the third day, I realized Evan and Lila weren't confused anymore. They were committed. The garage was no longer just a mistake. It was becoming a statement. Walls rising higher, roof trusses going in, even electrical rough-ins, starting like they were daring the system to catch up. I remember standing at the edge of my driveway one morning with coffee in my hand, watching a concrete truck back in, and feeling something shift in me. Not anger exactly, more like this quiet disbelief that people could choose denial so completely when the facts were literally beneath their feet. Douglas, my attorney, kept me updated daily, and he wasn't surprised. He said cases like this always reveal character faster than law ever does, and he warned me that people who build past a court order usually do it because they believe consequences only exist if they acknowledge them. On day 6, Evan actually came down to the property line while I was checking survey markers, like he wanted a face-to-face moment, and I'll never forget how casual he looked, hands in his pockets, coffee cup like it was a Saturday morning conversation instead of an active legal dispute. He said, "You really going to tear it down?" Like it was a personal overreaction rather than enforcement of law. And I told him no, I'm going to follow what the judge ordered. Nothing more. Nothing less, and he smiled in this thin way and said, "You're overplaying your hand, Caleb. This will cost you more than it's worth." That line stayed with me because it revealed something deeper. He genuinely believed financial pressure could override property boundaries, like everything had a price if you waited long enough. Lila stayed mostly in the background during this period, but I saw her once standing near the half-finished structure, just watching, not interfering, and I couldn't tell if she was worried or just detached, like she had already separated herself emotionally from whatever outcome was coming. Meanwhile, construction continued, and each day the garage became less like an intrusion and more like a finished object sitting in the wrong place. And that strange normalization was almost the most disturbing part. How quickly something illegal can start to look ordinary if you stare at it long enough. Douglas prepared everything for enforcement, sheriff notification, contractor authorization, documentation packets, because once the 14 days expired, there was no more debate left, only execution of the order, and I won't lie, I didn't sleep much that last night. I kept thinking about how absurd it was that I was preparing to remove a building from my own driveway just to get back to my own house. Like reality had looped back on itself in a way that made no sense. The morning of day 15 arrived clear and cold, and I drove down the long stretch of gravel slowly, noticing every detail more sharply than usual. The way the pines moved in the wind, the way dust settled differently where heavy trucks had passed, and when I turned the final bend, I saw it fully complete in its wrongness. A two-car garage sitting square across my access point like it had always belonged there. Douglas was already waiting with paperwork, and so was Tony, a local contractor Douglas trusted. A quiet guy with an excavator parked off to the side like it had been waiting for this moment longer than any of us wanted to admit. The sheriff's deputy arrived shortly after, not to intervene but to observe, to make sure everything stayed within the court order, and I remember him saying very little, just confirming we had legal authorization and then stepping back. Evan showed up about 20 minutes later, almost like he knew timing mattered, and when he saw the equipment and the paperwork in my hand, his expression changed immediately. That shift from confidence to disbelief that happens when someone realizes the system didn't stall like they expected. He walked fast toward me, asking if I was seriously going through with it, saying there had to be another option, that they were still willing to negotiate, but I just handed him a copy of the court order and said, "You had your 14 days. That was the last moment anything could have changed if they had chosen differently. When Tony started the machine, the sound cut through everything, and I still remember how strangely quiet the moment felt despite all that noise. Like everyone present understood this wasn't about destruction anymore. It was about correction. The excavator arm hit the corner first, and the garage didn't resist in any meaningful way. It just folded into itself, concrete cracking with snapping, rebar bending with that metallic scream that sticks in your memory longer than it should. And I watched it not with satisfaction exactly, but with this strange sense of finality, like watching something that should never have been there finally admit it didn't belong. Evan was shouting at some point, something about property damage and lawsuits, but the words felt distant because the reality of the situation was already decided somewhere else weeks ago in a courtroom where emotion didn't matter. Within hours it was gone, just debris and dust where a structure had stood for months, and suddenly my driveway wasn't theoretical anymore. It was usable again, clear, open, mine in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until it was blocked. I drove my truck up it slowly that evening just to feel it, like reclaiming something physical that had been mentally occupied for too long. And I remember thinking how strange it is that peace can feel like motion again after being stopped. Evan and Lila stood near what used to be their garage, and I could see it in their posture more than their faces, that collapse of certainty when reality finally arrives without negotiation. And Evan said something about appealing, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Douglas told me later that they filed a claim for construction costs, trying to recover nearly $18,000, and it didn't even survive the first hearing. The judge dismissed it almost immediately and ordered them to cover my legal fees, plus damages to the driveway and trees that had been removed during construction. And that was the part that felt almost anticlimactic after everything, like the system finally settling back into place after a disruption. But what stayed with me wasn't the legal outcome. It was the moment right before the excavator started, when everything was still possible and they still believed they could outweigh the law, because that's where the real fracture happened, not in the demolition, but in the assumption that rules are flexible if you push hard enough. And I still think about that sometimes when I pass that stretch of gravel road, because even though everything is back to normal now, There's a part of me that knows how quickly normal can be overwritten if someone simply decides to ignore boundaries long enough. And that leads into the final part of what happened after the dust settled, because the story didn't actually end when the garage came down. It ended in the courtroom, where the final consequences finally landed. After the dust settled, the silence that came back to my property felt almost unreal, like the land was trying to reset itself after months of tension I didn't fully realize I was carrying until it was gone. I could drive my truck up my driveway again without stopping, without that split second of disbelief every time I reached the blocked entrance. And yet, even with everything cleared, there was still a kind of echo in the air, the memory of something that should never have been built there in the first place. Evan and Lila didn't move away immediately. They stayed in the half-finished house next door, but the energy changed completely. No more architects coming and going, no more confident pacing around the property line, just a quiet kind of withdrawal, like the certainty they had arrived with had finally run out of room to exist. A week after the demolition, I got a call from Douglas, my attorney, and I could tell from his tone before he even said anything that this part wasn't going to go in their favor either. Evan had filed a claim attempting to recover construction expenses, arguing again that they had relied on builder measurements and acted in good faith. And for a moment, I remember just sitting there on my porch thinking how far people will go to avoid admitting a simple mistake, even when the ground itself proves them wrong. The hearing didn't last long, maybe minutes before the judge cut through it, reaffirming what had already been established, that the structure was built on my land, in violation of a clear court order, and any financial loss was a direct result of ignoring that order rather than a misunderstanding of it. The claim was dismissed outright, and on top of that, Evan and Lila were ordered to pay my legal fees, plus compensation for the driveway damage and the removal of trees that had been cleared during their construction work. And I remember Douglas saying afterward, almost quietly, "This is exactly how courts are supposed to work when people push too far." But the part that surprised me wasn't the financial ruling. It was the absence of anger I expected to feel, because by that point, what I felt wasn't victory. It was more like closure, not the dramatic kind, just the simple return of order after something had been temporarily overturned. I went down the driveway that evening walking instead of driving, just to see it differently, and I noticed small things I hadn't paid attention to before: tire marks fading, broken branches being replaced by new growth, the land doing what it always does when people stop interfering with it, slowly returning to itself without asking permission. Evan and I crossed paths one last time near the property line about 2 weeks later. No lawyers, no tension-filled setup, just two people standing on opposite sides of a fence line that suddenly felt much more real than it had before. He looked different, not defeated exactly, but quieter, like someone recalculating their understanding of how the world works. And he said something I didn't expect. He said he still believed there had been a misunderstanding, but he also didn't argue anymore, not the way he used to. I didn't respond with anything sharp or final. I just told him that land doesn't really care about intentions. It only responds to boundaries. And he nodded like he understood that in a way he hadn't before. Lila stayed inside most of the time during that final stretch, and I saw her once through their window looking out at the driveway. Not angry, not expressive, just still like she was processing how quickly a plan can collapse when it ignores reality at its foundation. Eventually, construction on their house slowed to almost nothing, then stopped entirely. And I heard through Douglas that they were considering selling the lot, though I never followed up on whether they actually did. Life on my side of the property went back to what it always was: quiet mornings, long stretches of silence broken only by weather and the occasional truck passing on the county road. But something in me had changed in a way I didn't fully notice until much later, a sharper awareness of how fragile assumptions can be when they're built on convenience instead of fact. I still think about that garage sometimes, not because it's gone, but because of how easily it almost became permanent if no one had stepped in, how a simple mistake in measurement, or more accurately a refusal to accept correction, turned into a structure sitting across someone else's life. And maybe that's the part that sticks with me the most. Not the demolition, not the court ruling, but the moment before any of it happened, when a choice was still being made and nobody involved fully understood how expensive that choice would become. If there's anything I learned from all of this, it's that boundaries aren't just lines on paper. Their agreements, reality, enforces whether people acknowledge them or not, and ignoring them doesn't bend the rules. It just guarantees a collision. So I'm curious what you think in a situation like this. Where do you draw the line between honest mistake and responsibility, and who do you think was really at fault here? Because I've heard every version of that argument already, and I still don't think there's an easy answer. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real property stories like this, subscribe, and I'll share the next one soon.